Hi, how's everybody doing today? All right, we're going to talk about chapter 7. And chapter 7 has a whole lot in it, which is why I kind of divided it up into several places. But this is basically how theater began in the West. It used to be that we would talk about this is how theater began. But of course, things happen differently in the East. And so we're going to talk about that in the next section. But this part right now, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share with you, excuse me, my screen, and hopefully everyone will be able to see this. And last time I had some difficulty with it. So hopefully everyone can see this, and I'm not going to spend 40 minutes talking and find out that I can't use this video, because that would be not good, not good. So right now we're going to look at Western theater traditions. And we're going to first talk about the Greek theater. And we have been told pretty much that the earliest recollection, we did find the things in Egypt, but what we really found a whole lot of was Greek theater. And we have scripts and we have documentation from the theater in Greece. And so that's kind of where we're starting. So 5 centuries BC. So 5 centuries BCE, before Common Era or before Christ, or however you want to say that. So it's about 2,500 years ago that we're looking. So a long time ago. So 2,500 years ago, 5th century BC, Athens was the political and cultural center of Western civilization. That's the documentation that we have. And it organized theater as we know it began in Greece. They had playwriting festivals, they had contests, and they were held annually, and plays were presented all day long. So all these little towns, they would have their own little theater troupes, and they would come up with, they usually did 3 tragedies and a comedy. And there were contests, and the best town got the laurels and all that kind of stuff. Kind of the way they did Olympics, they did theater that way too. So tragedy, our tragic playwrights that we have, there are 3 major tragic playwrights, and they are Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. And Aeschylus was the first one that developed plays that had more than one person talking at a time, where, you know, people, what happened was there used to be a chorus. They did what are called dithyrambs, and there were a whole lot of people, and they would all come out and they would do things together. And one actor, we're going to talk about him in a minute, stepped out from the crowd and started speaking on his own. And his name was Thespis. And that's where we get the term thespian. If any of you were in high school and you were in the Thespian Society, that's what it's about. It's about the first known actor that we have in Greece, whose name was Thespis. Aeschylus actually wrote plays where they had 2 people talking, so they'd have a dialogue, and Sophocles wrote it where there were actually 3 people on stage talking, or 3 actors that could go and change masks and come back out again. For comedy, we have Aristophanes, and he's kind of the guy that we have a lot of his comedy, but anyhow, he did a lot of political commentary and things like that. So Aeschylus, he's the oldest Greek tragic playwright that we have. He's known for strict adherence to the rules of playwriting. So he did it the way that it was supposed to be done. You know, things were supposed to happen. They had these rules in place where tragedy only could deal with nobility, and comedy could only deal with common people, and things like that. And Aeschylus followed the rules. He wrote Agamemnon. That's his probably his most famous, maybe most well done play. And he's kind of known for that, Agamemnon. And it's about, I had to read Agamemnon when I was in college, and it's another tragic king figure who gets killed and, you know, dies at the end. Now you know the story. So there. Then there's Sophocles, and we're reading Sophocles' work right now called Oedipus the King, or Oedipus Rex. He's considered by many to be the best tragedy writer ever in the world. And even Aristotle. When Aristotle was writing his those 6 major things that every tragedy should have, he was writing it about Sophocles' work, about Oedipus Rex, because he thought Sophocles was the best writer as well. So the play Oedipus Rex is actually part of a trilogy. It's the second part. The third part I know is called Oedipus at Colonus. And I can't even remember what the first part is called. And there I am going to a blank. But anyhow, it's a 3-part trilogy about the story of Oedipus Rex. And there's actually, it goes on to talk about his daughters too. I think, and it was written kind of out of order, like this one, it's the second one, but it was written first. It's really interesting. But Oedipus Rex, hopefully you've all read it by this point, but it is a very, very well-known story. And it was well-known to the Greeks then. The Greeks knew the story of Oedipus Rex. It would be the equivalent to us going to see a story of Cinderella, a story of Little Red Riding Hood, a story of some story that we, Goldilocks and the Three Bears, some story that we had been told since childhood. We know what happened. We know who the players are. We know, all the tragic things that happen. I mean, those are kind of fairy tales, so they're not quite as grim, although Grimm's fairy tales are pretty grim. If you read the real Cinderella, they cut off the sister's toe to try to cram it in the shoe. Anyhow, that's why they're called grim. And, in Little Red Riding Hood, the grandmother actually gets eaten. And so all those nice things. But anyhow, so everybody knew the story and they went to go see it anyway because they wanted to see how it played. It's like people go see, all right, are we going to see Batman again? Right. How many versions of Batman are there? We will go to see it how this person tells the story and how they treat the characters. And that's how they did it then too. Euripides, he was actually very sympathetic of the causes of women. He was kind of an advocate when there weren't a lot. And he kind of pared the chorus down to just a few actors. It used to be 50, and then they went down to 12, and I think he got it up to about 15, and that's where they kept it. He wrote Medea, and Medea is the story of a very, it's a tragedy. It's of the king and the king's wife and all this nobility, and her husband is leaving her, and I cannot remember what he did, but whatever it was so heinous that she did not want, he had condemned her to die or something, and she wasn't going to leave her children behind for him to raise and mess up, so she kills her children. Yeah, not Mother of the Year award stuff, but anyhow, he understood their plight a little bit more, and he talked more about women than other playwrights did. And Aristophanes, remember, he's the one that we have the comedies for. And so he wrote comedies, and a lot of his plays are really body and physical in nature. He wrote things called The Frogs and The Birds, and their lines are like they're supposed to sound like frogs. And the comedies that they did at this time in Greece, there were a lot of penis jokes, just saying. They had leather phalluses, leather penises basically made and strapped on them so they looked enormous and just ridiculous. And that was a lot of the satyr plays did that. But they did a lot of pee-pee jokes, just saying. But he wrote The Frogs. So The Frogs is the one he's most known for. This is kind of like what the Greek theater looked like, the architecture. So this is the theatron. So we know that that's where we get the word now for theater. And it's basically where everybody sat. This is carved into the mountainside. Okay, so it's going up. Okay, you're looking at this, and this is kind of where they sat. This is the skina, so this is where the scenery was, and the little hut where they would go in and change masks. And on top of this is where they'd have the mechanisms. One of them is called a Deus ex machina, and we'll talk about it. It would lower, it literally means God of the machine, and you would lower the gods down to the orchestra here where they are playing. This is a bird's eye view of it. So like the God would come whoa, and save the day. These are called the parados, and that's basically, these are the pathways that the actors, the chorus would enter and exit from. And then the middle here is called the orchestra. And this was actually the stage. This is where they played. They played where the orchestra is. And now we put an orchestra there, right? We put the musicians there and kind of cut it in half, put the musicians here and then the actors play back here. But the orchestra was actually the playing space. And this is what it looked like for real. The biggest festival was called the City Dionysia, and this is the theater of Dionysus. So it was a theater that was dedicated to the Greek god Dionysus, and he is the god of theater. And so this is in Athens, and you can see it's in ruin, but you can see that this is where the people sat, okay? And this is where the playing place happened, and this is where the skina was back here, and the parados here on each side. I think I actually have, there's a little bit better picture. Oh, this is a different, it's the same build. You can tell it's actually in use today because they have some scaffolding out there. It looks like they were using it to come over and build some things. And this is at, if I say this right, Epidaurus, okay? And so Athens wasn't the only place to have the theater. So this was a theater at Epidaurus, but you can see how far away those people are if you had to sit way up here. So they had to project their voices, which is a lot of times why they have a whole chorus saying it at one time. So if one person says it, it's, you know, this loud, but if two people say it, it's this loud. And so they'd have a chorus. Like I said, in the beginning, there were 50 voices all in unison. But if you've ever tried to speak as a chorus, it's not always so easy. It's easier to sing with a chorus than it is to speak with a chorus, because getting the timing it's tricky. So it's something that they had to work on. And when you had actors here, they dedicated their lives to this. If they were an actor, this is all they did. And they had people who sponsored them. There were people in the town that was their job. They were the choragus, and their job was to work with the theatrical troupe to sponsor them, to basically pay for their meals and pay for their housing and pay for their costumes and everything else, so that they could do this once a year at the big festival. Kind of like how we get sponsors to sponsor our Olympic gymnasts, right? They don't do any other job. They just train all the time because that's what their job is. So then Rome came over and conquered Greece. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, so, and Rome liked the theater they saw. So they said, wow, we want to do that too. And so they decided, I did not create this graphic, but yes, now it's Rome. So my predecessor created the graphic. Roman theater, they built it, it looks very much like Greek theater. Okay, except for the skina back here is solid. It's not just standing out there in the open. It's solid, and they all sort of had this same design. So we still have everybody sitting up in the mountainside, but it's a little bit smaller. And we have entrances here and here, but there's also entrances here, here, and you can't see them, but like right here where the steps are, right underneath the steps, there's another entrance here. There's another entrance here. There's like another entrance over here. And like all of these entrances got you out onto the stage area. And all of these entrances got everybody out into the same place, and they are called the vomitorium. So they literally like vomit the people out there. Like all of a sudden, a whole bunch of people come out. It's like they're vomited out on stage. I did not name it. That is what it is called, the vomitorium. All right, and this is where they would perform. So, but Greek theater, or Greek theater was special because they only did theater. They had a lot of other things going on. It was a festival. They had political rallies and they had, all these other things, but theater was like a whole day big event. For the Roman theater, they used the theaters for different things as well. And they had several things going on at once. You could either come in here and you could watch a show, or you could go out there and watch acrobats, or you could go down there and watch circus animals. They had all sorts of things going on at one time. So, but Rome really liked the stuff they saw in Greece, so they stole most of their theatrical practices. They said, hey, that looks good. We're going to do it over here. And the spectacle and gore were really prevalent elements in Roman entertainment. So like in Oedipus, as I'm sure you have all read by now, at the end, he gouges out his eyes. Well, when they did that, it was told, I'd heard stories that they took peeled grapes and dip them in, red dye or whatever. And like when Oedipus comes out, he like throws them on the ground. So it's like his eyeballs popped out. So they were really into the gore and stuff. They really liked the spectacle. And they changed the architecture by making it larger, by making this back part larger. So they could go up here and they could do balcony scenes. And they had a lot more backstage. Okay. When the Roman Empire collapsed, Western civilization lost its centralized government. So remember, Rome went and conquered everybody and everything. All roads lead to Rome. That's because from Rome, they all went out and made roads to France and to, Spain and to everywhere that they were conquering. They get to the water, they have to take boats the rest of the way. But there are still, if you go over to England, there are still Roman roads there because they had to have a place to get their chariots and had to get their stuff in there. So they were really great architects and they were really great road builders and aqueducts and all those wonderful things that people didn't have before, but they also, kind of owned everything. So when it collapsed, because Nero was all full of himself, right? The whole government collapsed. And so the whole unified culture that had existed everywhere with respect for its intellectual activities, including theater going, all of that collapsed as well. So they were no more one great big country, which was good because they were kind of crazy. But then they were all these disjointed things, and scholars and things couldn't share amongst all these other places anymore because all these other places were now closed and they were all, to themselves. So theater kind of died. So theater, it kind of blew up, and the church said theater is bad because, the Romans were doing it and all of those things are sinful. And so we called it the Dark Ages. And it's called the Dark Ages because there were not a lot of innovations that happened for like 1,000 years. So there were no new practices in medicine. There were no new inventions, nothing to write home about. I mean, there might have been a little bit here or there, but again, they call it the Dark Ages because people stopped sharing information. And so only in their little burg did they know what was going on. So that's when we move on to the medieval times. Okay, so since Rome was gone, the church took over as the entity in charge, at least in Europe. And they were in charge and ruled every aspect of life. Okay, theater was initially thought to be evil, bad theater. And anybody associated with theater were pirates or bums or harlots. In Greek theater, women did not act at all. In Roman theater, they allowed them to somewhat, but then it was all gone. Excuse me as I take a sip. My Diet Pepsi. Okay. Then later, give or take 900 years, theater reappears in the most unlikely place, in the worship service. Okay, as part of the worship service, there was something called the Quem Quitoris trope. And if you watch the crash course on that, it was the three Marys going to the tomb after Jesus died, and they ask the angel, where is he? Or the angel says, whom do you seek? And the Marys say, Jesus of Nazareth. And they say, he is not here. He has risen. Go and tell everyone. And like that's the extent of the lines. But they did that in church. So that was called liturgical drama. And then they started parading about doing these things. After it was in the church, they moved it outside the church and made it part of the vernacular. But all of these plays dealt with biblical stories and moral lessons. So after we had the liturgical dramas in the church, it then became vernacular, and vernacular means the language of the people. So if they were in Spain, it was in Spanish. If they were in France, it was in French. If they were in England, it was in English, and so on. And they would have these big, like almost a parade of wagons. And these wagons, they would build a set on, and they called them mansions. And they would roll these out and like set them up in town. And it's not known whether you would go to one and watch that show and then go to the next one and watch that show, or if you stayed still and then the mansions moved. I'm thinking more likely the people went around to each one, because some of these things were set up elaborately. Noah and the ark, every year they waited to see how they were going to do that, because the people would make it rain there on the stage. And I think that they had so much water, they had it rain for 5 full minutes. That's a lot of water. It's a lot of water to be pouring out. But, and they had like at the they had heaven and they had hell. And it was all of the stories of the Bible. So it would start with Adam and Eve and creation. And, and then again, they'd have Noah's Ark, and they'd have, different things. And then they would have the life story of Jesus. But, at the very end, they had hell and the hell mouth, and people got to dress up as demons and run around. And so they had costumes and sets and all sorts of things there in the medieval theater. So the theater grew from the church and then went outside the church, but it was still all about church-like things. The theater guilds would present these plays. So for instance, Noah's Ark went to the shipwrights, the people who built ships. And what else were they saying? The people that would do the Last Supper, they would make the goblets or whatever that contained the bread and wine, that would go to the goblet smiths, the people that actually worked in that kind of metal. So they were part of the guilds. If you were part of the guild, you could work on that show. So again, this was also sponsored by the people, not necessarily by the government, but the government would assign you to your guild. And then so that would kind of fund the shows. So again, it was part of the city that would do that. There were portable stages, like I said, and they were called pageant wagons. And the whole series of plays was called a cycle. So it started with, like I said, Adam and Eve, and went all the way through till, Jesus rising again or whatever. And that was called a cycle. And the most famous cycle that we have is called the Wakefield cycle. And in my other class, I'd make you read some of it. But they threw comedy in there. In the Noah and the Ark, it's called Noah and His Sons. And actually in it starts to rain and he can't get his wife to get into the boat. And she's like, no, I'm not getting in there. Are you kidding? No, you're crazy. So it's pretty funny. This is kind of what a medieval pageant wagon looked like. Somebody that would be pulling it along, and they'd be performing here. Again, we don't know if they were actually moving when they were performing, if they would stop, do their show, if people would go from pageant wagon to pageant wagon, but this is certainly how they moved. They had horses and pulled them and everything, and they were on these wagons, these pageant wagons that called mansions again. Then we had the Renaissance. So we were in Greek, went to Rome, we went to, the medieval times through the Dark Ages to the Renaissance. And the Renaissance gave us a lot of stuff. Renaissance means rebirth. It's like for 1,000 years, we were kind of dead. And now we're reborn. It's like, oh, look, there is art. Oh, look, there is poetry. Oh, look. Oh, there's intellectual conversation. Oh, we can invent things now. Oh, we can better our lives. So there's a lot going on. And it was a general renewal in interest in the humanities. So art, music, theater, philosophy, things that had to do with people, humanities. So people were, again, excited about it. This is actually Leonardo da Vinci, okay? And Leonardo da Vinci, not only was he a great artist in the Renaissance, he was an inventor. He created so many inventions and contraptions. He invented a catapult, and things like that. But Italy experienced the longest period of the Renaissance. Its love of art and all the humanities lasted longer than did in some of the other areas. But Italy was not known for its great literary achievements during the Renaissance, but it was more known for its great artwork. But the visual arts, painting, drawing, sculpture, architecture, those were prevalent during the Italian Renaissance. The Teatro Olimpico. Okay, so this is the first indoor theater. So remember those pictures that I showed you before? Theater was outside. Okay, and it was outside. So when did it have to take place? During the day. Okay, at night, not so much. They didn't have spotlights. They didn't have electricity. So this is really new to have an indoor theater. You can see it only has windows in the back. So they actually had to get candles and light up the stage when they were doing this. It was designed by Palladio, and it utilized the concept of forced perspective. This is what the Renaissance is really known for. So they have this archway here, and these, this is when they learned how to draw forced perspective, so they learned how to build forced perspective. So that this looks like it's a big, long alleyway. And actually it is, they're getting smaller and smaller, so that if you stood back here, your head would be up here, as you're walking down here. But the forced perspective made it possible for them to look like they were on a city street instead of just in front of one big scena, which was what they were before. So the forced perspective was huge in the Renaissance, and it changed the way theater was done. Okay, this is the Teatro Farnese. Okay, it's another indoor theater. You can see how we still have the curved look where people would sit, and we still have the center here that people could act. But they still had a lot of acting that went on up here and back here. And sometimes they put chairs here to face the stage. This one was built in 1618. It's still around today. It's the earliest existing proscenium arch theater that we still have. Okay, now the thing that Italy is known for is Commedia dell'arte. This is a style of acting, and it's specific, and it's kind of all its own. But it grew out of here and it kept going. It still happens today. This was the commons people theater. This wasn't, they didn't have to pay exorbitant fees to go. This wasn't something like when they started building indoor theaters, they started building them just for nobility at first. So what did the common people do? Well, this is what they did. These were traveling players that would go to everyone's town and they would perform out in the streets. They didn't have to have a proscenium theater. They didn't have to have any kind of theater. They just, any spot that they had, they'd be able to perform their show. They had stock characters. And what that means is, you might recognize this one. This one, I think he's Puccini. They also call him Harlequin. Okay, and it's the diamonds you can recognize. There were certain kinds. So if you were an actor and say you were a good-looking young man or a pretty young girl, you would be cast as one of the lovers. Because in every play was pretty much the same sort of things happened. Okay, so there were the lovers. There was a doddering old doctor who thought he knew a whole lot but didn't really know anything. There was the person who was the soldier but was really a coward. And then they had these servant roles. And they had like the old lech. Like there was some old man that was always trying to marry the young girl, but she was really in love with the lover and had to convince her father to let her marry, you know, the one that she loved rather than, you know, the old lech. And but there were always servant characters. And you've heard of the term slapstick. I'm looking to see if I have something that's like this. Okay, this is actually a cleaning tool of mine. But basically it was a stick. And when they used it, when they would slap the character with it, and it would go. So it would make this big loud slap. Now that didn't really hurt me. It stacked together. So it was built like this, and it would just make the sound. And so they'd fall and it would go. So that's what's known as slapstick comedy. It's very physical. When people trip, they go, oh, and they'd fall, and you'd hear the stick. Or when they smack each other on stage, they'd use the slapstick so it would make the sound louder. And these they were, again, servant characters or fools, and they're still known for that today. They didn't have any scripts, so you knew what your character was, and the storylines were kind of all, you know, similar. They called them the Lazi, like, oh, we're going to do the Lazi where, you know, you're the father and you're the daughter, and, you know, and you come in and you say you want to marry the girl. Or they'd change it up a bit, but they had them they were improv'd, but they kind of knew the plot of what they were going to do. So these troops worked together all the time. They traveled from town to town. So they go, okay, we're going to do this one, this one, this one. And they had it memorized, but they could say things, you know, different things. They didn't have lines that they had to read and memorize. They memorized the plots more or less. And they go, okay, we're going to do this, this, and this. And they influenced playwrights for many centuries to come. Even today, you can still see some modern, you know, slapstick comedy. The Three Stooges isn't very modern anymore, but the Three Stooges were based off of this. And a lot of physical humor you see. You know, the whole slipping on a banana peel where you don't think it's funny, but you do kind of. Or, you know, if you go to a circus act or whatever, you'll see some things like this. If you go to Italy, you'll still see Commedia dell'arte performed, and probably in many other places. Okay, so now the Spanish Renaissance. Lope de Vega. Okay, this is the famous playwright of the Spanish Renaissance. There were many, many plays written in Spain during this time. So we have like 30,000 plays. In Greek, you know, we have like, you know, 50 or something like that. And in Rome, we have, you know, even less. But from the Spanish Renaissance, we have 30,000 plays. We still have the scripts, and by 1,700 authors. And in Spain, there were actually women authors too. So that's interesting to note. But Lope de Vega was the most prolific playwright. His plays tended to obsess about a narrow code of honor and not probe into other human endeavors. So it was like you needed to to have a good heart, you needed to be right, you needed to not cheat on people and not commit adultery, and you needed to be honorable and follow the laws that you're supposed to follow. And Spain became almost exclusively Catholic, while the rest of Europe struggled with religious wars. There were the Protestants versus the Catholics, had wars in France and in England and Germany, all over the place. There were all these internal wars going on, civil wars. But Spain, they had such a heavy rule that everybody just stayed Catholic. So it's one of the reasons why they have so many plays, right? It's because they were writing plays while everybody else was warring. The English Renaissance. Okay. Oh, that's all stuck there, right? Primary contribution was the great theatrical literature, the time of Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Webster. Now, Christopher Marlowe, just a fun fact, he's the one that actually came up with iambic pentameter, which is what Shakespeare used all the time. And it was basically, it's a stressed and an unstressed word or vowel that is pentameter, 5 sections long. To be or not to be, that is the question. But soft what light through yonder window breaks. Okay. And we think, oh, that's kind of weird that they wrote it that way. But the reason that they wrote it that way was because, remember, not a lot of people could read and needed to be able to memorize quickly. So they wrote it like that so they could memorize it. So it helped them with the memorization, and it was also beautiful poetry once it's read. I likened it to Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss does iambic quadrimeter, I guess, because he only has 4. I do not like green eggs and ham. I do not like them, Sam, I am. Okay. 1 fish, 2 fish, red fish, blue fish. Okay. So Dr. Seuss used iambic quadrimeter and Shakespeare used iambic pentameter. So Christopher Marlowe actually came up with this, and they called it the mighty line. And Christopher Marlowe was a good playwright, but he died very young. He was 27, and he died in a barroom fight. Okay, so a very sad ending to what could have been a really promising life and career. I mean, he's the one that developed this, and then Shakespeare took off with it. So, William Shakespeare. So he's considered by many to be the greatest playwright ever. He wrote 37 plays that exist today, 16 comedies, 10 histories, and 11 tragedies. And you are going to be asked to read Hamlet, which is probably his best well-known tragedy. And we'll talk a little bit about that. In my next video, I'm going to give you a little bit of rundown of Hamlet. But he wrote all of his stuff and then he wrote, on top of that, he wrote other poetry. We have sonnets from him as well, which are also, they're 16 lines, and they're like A, B rhyme, and then they end with a couplet. So it's really interesting. And they're all iambic pentameter also. But he was able to craft these into some of the most beautiful pieces of work that we have. He also, I cannot remember the number, but he came up with words that we use today that were not words back then. So for instance, the word eyeball. Eyeball was not a word. It was eye. And he used it, and I do not know which play he used it in, but he came up with, I know that he came up with the word eyeball. That's the trivia that I have. But he wrote a lot of plays, and he used the iambic pentameter, and he used it well. And he's known for the universal quality of his plays' themes. He, kind of like the Greeks, he didn't come up with most of the storylines. Most of these are well-known stories. Romeo and Juliet, it takes place in Italy because it was an Italian tale. I mean, he's in England. And so a lot of these stories were stories that people knew, but then, you know, it was the way that he treated them. Like I said, we might go see the next Batman. We know what happens. We know what happens to Batman, but we'll go see the new one. So we'll see how somebody else treats the story. So that's what they did with a lot of stories then. A lot of stories were not, you know, that they just made them up. It was how they treated the story. Shakespeare died in 1616. And in 1642, there was a civil war over religion. So remember, we told you about these religious civil wars. It wasn't just Protestants, it was the like the Quakers, the same people who were pilgrims or whatever. They kicked out the king at the time. Actually, they beheaded him. And theater and the religion took over, and theater was viewed as an evil practice, and the new regime made it illegal. It was banned. You could no longer, you know, do theater because you were bad if you did. So this is Shakespeare's grave. It's like the grave of the poet William Shakespeare, and this is what it says on his grave: "Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be ye man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones." So it's basically saying, don't dig me up, leave me alone. Things to know, okay? But anyhow, so after he died in 1616, in 1642, they beheaded Charles I. Charles II, I believe, ran away, and so did all the nobility, went over to France, and theater was outlawed. Ban, go away theater, bad theater. In 1660, Charles II came back from France and was restored to the throne. So they call it the Restoration, because they so he was gone for that almost 20 years. Okay. And then it kind of calmed down over there. The religious freaks calmed down, and Charles went back and was restored to the throne, and was now able to rule England again. So Charles came back, and so did the rest of the nobility. So during the Restoration then, they had some different practices. They had been over in France, and they saw how France was doing it. So they changed the theater some. So the forestage was enlarged, and most of the acting took place on it. And wing and drop settings were being used, but the scenery was just mainly for decoration. So I think I'd sent you a video of that, of the Droppingham, I can't remember the name, Dottingham. It was where all of the scenery comes in and moves by somebody turning things from underneath the stage. That's the wing and drop, and the wings would come in and the drops would come down. And they used that kind of scenery. And women were finally allowed to perform the theater for the first time in history, because you see, women were performing in France, and they were over there in France for almost 20 years. And when they came back, they said, well, I guess it's okay. Women perform over here. They should perform over there. So women were finally allowed to perform on the stage. This is way after Shakespeare's time, because during Shakespeare's time, only men played the women roles. They would get young men, especially, to play female roles, because they had higher voices and didn't have as much beards to shave off. Okay, so they did something called the Comedy of Manners, and it didn't have many manners. Let me tell you, they had a lot of witty dialogue. It was sophisticated and superficial society. It was about nobility, but it was all about affairs, and they made fun basically of themselves, and they thought it was funny too. And it was theater for the wealthy. It was very sophisticated, and this was the Comedy of Manners, but they were comedies, And again, they were making fun, but they were making fun of themselves, and they all thought it was just hysterical. Moliere. So we go back over to France now. So Moliere lived in France, and he wrote comedies, and he had his own theatrical troupe. Okay, and it was heavily influenced by Commedia dell'arte. He really liked that kind of a troupe, and he liked that camaraderie. So he had his troupe so that they could have kind of stock characters. He wrote plays called Tartuffe and the Misanthrope, and actually they did Tartuffe at UIW last semester. We went to go see it, and it's really interesting. And so they also made fun of people's foibles, of things that they didn't like with society. And so that's kind of how the Comedy of Manners came about. But Tartuffe himself, oh, let me go back. Can I go back? Go back. So let me talk a little bit, not Tartuffe. Moliere himself, he was actually, Tartuffe makes fun of religious hypocrisy. So one of the central characters, the character Tartuffe, actually is supposed to be a very religious, pious man, but really he's kind of duping people, and he's flirting with the wife, and he's trying to marry the daughter when she's, of course, it's like the whole lover thing that I told you, has the other intended that she's really in love with, the young guy. And of course, he's an old guy. And he's also duping the homeowner. This all takes place in one home. He's duping the homeowners so that he can, he ends up signing his deed over to him and saying, oh, you're my heir, you get to have my house and everything. And then when he realized he's being duped, he's like, yeah, but you got to get out now because I have your house. So luckily the king comes in and says, no, we realized, we looked up, you know, Tartuffe, and we realized he's wanted in 3 other cities, and we're taking him in, and all lives happily ever after. Okay, so then we move on to the 19th century. And remember, 19th century means 1800s. Just like right now we're in the 2000s and we're in the 21st century. So we're living the 21st century. The 1900s were the 20th century. So the 1800s were the 19th century. It's very confusing, I know. But we've gone all the way back, and now we're to the 1800s, the early modern age. They call it the modern age of drama, starting in the 1800s. So there was a fascination with the occult and with the supernatural. This is around the time that Dracula was written and Frankenstein. Okay, and these are thought to be very romantic beliefs, not romantic like I love you, but romantic like supernatural, like not of this earth. Okay, and melodrama was the primary theatrical form. And we think of melodrama now, we think of, oh no, what are you doing? And we think of people overacting. Well, they did overact, but that was kind of the form, that was kind of the genre that they were doing. But they were being serious when they did that. No, don't take my baby, you know. But you know, there were real tears when they did it. So in melodrama, we had stock characters. We had a hero, we had a villain, we had the heroine, you know, and these are the people that, again, a lot of like Commedia dell'arte kind of falls into what we still do, how we still have characters and things. So these stock characters are important. Uncle Tom's Cabin was the most popular play in the United States, and it was a melodrama. Okay. And then lastly, we talk about the Booth family. You know, we talk about the Kardashians now, and everybody knows who they are, whether you watch them or know the show or, you know, follow anything at all. If you say, oh, the Kardashians, you know who you're talking about. Well, back in the 1800s, the Booth family, these were actors. And they were actors, and they acted in New York, and they acted, and they toured the country, and everyone knew who Edwin Booth was. And they were very famous actors. So their father was Junius Brutus Booth. Okay, and he was an actor. And then his sons were Edwin Booth, who was the most famous American actor of the day. Okay, everyone knew who Edwin Booth was. Junius Booth. And then there was John Wilkes Booth, who is the one that assassinated President Lincoln. So talk about fame, okay? Something tells me he was probably cut out of Daddy's will, although he probably didn't live to see the will. But anyhow, I'm sure that Brother Edwin was not happy about it. And it makes, I mean, I came to a revelation not that long ago. I'm like, oh, John Wilkes Booth was an actor, and he assassinated Lincoln while Lincoln was watching a play in the theater. Well, whether John Wilkes Booth was acting there or not, because he was an actor, he had probably acted in that theater many times, and nobody would question why he was in the theater, why, you know, he wasn't some strange man lurking about. He was somebody who belonged there. So nobody kicked him out or asked him what he was doing when he was going around there. So that kind of like was an aha, you know, light bulb to me. But so anyhow, yes, famous actor, famous assassin, brothers. How nice. Okay. That is the end right now of Theater in the West. I'm going to come back and I'm going to do a little bit about Hamlet, but then we're going to talk about Theater in the East after this. All right. I hope y'all are having a great week, and I'll talk to you later. Thanks. Bye-bye.